Good morning. Thank you for that very generous introduction. I'll try to live up to it. Let me begin by thanking the Memory Studies Association. It's a real honor to be here. And I thank specially Catherine Gilbert for inviting me and the local organizer of the conference, Alison Atkinson Phillip, for asking me to be here. Thank you so much. Because this gave me an opportunity to think about some of the questions that I'd been engaging with for a while. And I felt this was the perfect opportunity to bring various aspects of my academic life together. So, the post-industrial material and social landscape of Newcastle, from which this conference draws its inspiration, is something I can certainly relate to. In fact, I remember my first visit to Newcastle in 1991, when it looked very different. And parts of the exhibition I saw yesterday on shipbuilding actually rekindled memories of growing up in an industrial landscape. I had grown up in a landscape that was dotted with collieries. I always saw the pithead winding gear when I approached home coming back from college. And that's my grandfather, who was a doctor in this industrial town. The city was called Burnpur, burn as in burning. It was literally the city that burns, a steel town with blast furnaces that colored the skies orange, purple, gray, and green. Our little factory town had a very mixed population. Germans, English, Scottish, and Australians, Indian engineers from northern and southern India. The workers were mostly local, from villages nearby, many from Bihar, the bordering state, and a sizable number came from the Santal belt, bringing their songs into the factory floor. And we heard them sing as they walked home every evening. But the club was very British and organized dances and musical evenings, Christmas parties. And every year there was a festival called the Bongo Sangskriti Utsav that actually invited Indian classical singers and folk musicians and theatre performers. Apart from these organized activities, seasonal changes were marked by performances with village performers visiting our part of the town. So the heart of this industrial town opened itself up to ancient cultures and memories of another way of life that was still lived. My grandmother regularly invited the Kirtaniyas, who are traditional singers, to sing of the medieval saint Chaitanya. And they would sing about the saint from Nadia, which is another district in Bengal, asking him to leave that place and become a living presence when they are singing in their little group. But it took me a long time to really understand their songs, and even longer to figure out the reasons why I was not able to relate to their way of remembering the saint. Chaitanya was their friend, a friend of the heart, one they recognized as a person who saw them as they were, moving beyond the social identities that bound them. Their songs formed a part of a deeper quest that was evident in many performative traditions in India. We also listen to the bauls, or the wandering singers in Bengal, who represent a syncretic tradition and articulate a specific musical tradition. And that was another group of singers that I was familiar with growing up, and they're still around. So let's listen to Parvati Baul, who was not born into this tradition, but embraced it as her way of life when she was a student at Tagore's University, Vishwabharati. I'll have to come here to turn music. This song that Parvati is singing for us is composed by Lalun Phokir, the Baul who died more than a century ago in 1890 and whose tomb is in Kushtia, present-day Bangladesh. And yet these songs still remain alive in Bangladesh and West Bengal, the two Bengals that are separated by partition. So I wanted to begin with this question: what does this mirror that the Bauls sing about, does this mirror hold out a lesson about memory? What can we learn in that city of mirrors? What have we forgotten? And why do we never get a glimpse of that elusive neighbor? And what makes it difficult and almost impossible to learn those lessons within post-colonial societies, despite the fact we are surrounded by traditions of orality and practices of memory? What has caused this disruption, where wisdom traditions that still survive are no longer seen as salient for understanding the relationship between our past and memory? Have we forgotten to listen? Or have our ears become attuned to other forms of speech and music that interfere with our understanding of what the Bauls and other keepers of memory sing about? Though I shall focus mainly on India, what I say would resonate with Bangladesh, Pakistan, Nepal, Sri Lanka, or any country where wisdom traditions survive in oral forms and songs, performances, and stories remain a part of living traditions. These traditions, I suggest, express in particular ways the relationship between the past and memory. I shall also clarify in the course of my talk why I call it the past and not history. In India and in much of South Asia, where we live with multiple forms of orality, such traditions have been collected from the early 20th century by none other than the poet Rabindranath Tagore himself. He was particularly fascinated by oral traditions and being instrumental in getting teachers like Keti Mohan Sen, who you see there with Gandhiji, and then you see him reading the address at Tagore's, the last birthday celebration before he died in 1940. Keti Mohan Sen, it's spelled that way, but it's pronounced Keti Mohan Sen, so is actually the grandfather of Amartya Sen. The song I just played is a song about forgetting, an amnesia that disables self-recognition. The city of mirrors that has fascinated the Bauls is also the mirror of one's heart, something that turns up in numerous oral performative traditions. The 15th century saint poet Kabir sings about another song, and I'm not going to play that one, which says, "Hriday maje aarsi aur mukh dikha nahi jaye, mukh to tab dekhoge jab dil ki duvida jaye." There's a mirror in your heart and yet you cannot see your face. Only when your doubts and uncertainty leave you will you see your face reflected in that mirror. The mirror, as the Baul and the Fakir tradition pushes us to see, is a mirror that reflects our true self, the self that stays when all doubts have vanished. This higher truth is what the Bauls seek. History and its cunning corridors have no attraction for them. Once Keti Mohan Sen had asked a Baul, why do they not keep historical records? And, he says that he asked the Baul this, and the Baul answered, "Do boats that sail over the flooded river leave any mark? What should these boatmen of the muddy track, urged on by their need, know of the simple way? The true endeavor is to keep oneself simply afloat in the stream of devotion that flows through the lives of classes of men among the Bauls. But they're all Bauls. They have no other achievement or history. All the streams that fall into the Ganges become the Ganges. So must we lose ourselves in the common stream, else it'll cease to be living. That wondrous city of mirrors, the Baul tells us, reflects everything, shows us things as they really are. It appears close, and yet it is far, familiar yet unfamiliar. It reflects what we no longer recognize about ourselves. This mirror does not tell us about who's the fairest or most beautiful, but asks us to see if we recognize the neighbor who lives within that mirror. This is clearly not the mirror of history, but the mirror of what shapes our understanding of the self. Time's fleeting nature might leave a mark, but the mirror invites one to look beyond that into one's own heart, so that we recognize that this neighbor is not really a stranger, but our own true self. Some years ago, while speaking at a forum of oral historians, I pointed out the critical lessons that these traditions hold out for oral historians. Since then, I've had a chance to reflect further and feel perhaps that songs like these hold out lessons for scholars of memory too. That a community's response to historical events is often stored deep in collective memory and sometimes embedded in oral traditions has been explored by scholars in Africa. And we all know that Jan van Sinna, in oral traditions as history, and the scholar from the UK, George Ewart Evans, have looked at, how villagers might be carriers of a culture and a way of life from another time. These pioneers, in fact, point out how oral traditions can be used as a resource to understand the relationship between historical events and folk narratives, the folk memories of the past and folk understanding of the present, and more generally, between history and memory. Within such a framework, however, memory serves history, but what constitutes the historical remains unquestioned. Is it possible to imagine that some communities, especially those communities for whom traditions are still living traditions, the past is available in other ways, and memory serves a different purpose altogether, since the performers live outside history? So I'll take you to Ashish Nandi, the cultural theorist's idea that there are millions of people who still live outside history. They do have theories of the past. They do believe that the past is important and shapes the present and the future. But they also recognize and confront and live with a past different from that constructed by historians and historical consciousness. They even have a very different way of arriving at that past. The discipline of history, which has colonial origins in India, organizes itself in ways that make other approaches to the past unrecognizable as history. And I quote Vivek Harishwar, who says that historical consciousness has indeed become a major part of the colonial consciousness, to the latter's parasitic use of colonial descriptions of Indian social and intellectual world. Tagore and Gandhi's understanding of how Indian traditions relate to the past is something that Harishwar elaborates on. He says that the violence of colonialism, Gandhi realized, consisted in very deeply fragmenting the saliences that had organized the practitioner matrix, thereby in the long run undermining the very integrity of experience. His attempt to reorganize those saliences drew from the same resources that had indeed enabled him to see how the violence of colonialism had a disintegrating effect on experience itself. How can new sites of learning be brought into being so that the automatism of actions and trauma of occurrences be transformed into experience, and the fantasy that conceals the parasitic nature and perpetuates desire be therapeutically engaged, if not removed? The crucial concept here is that of sites of learning. That is what Harishwar says Gandhi creates. And I think when Gandhi attempts to present a new understanding of tradition by turning them into sites of learning, because colonial consciousness that draws on colonial concepts to create historical truths turn away from other ways of relating to the past, that's where I feel we have a lesson about not being enslaved by history in the way colonialism taught us to do, and therefore turning to these traditions to see that maybe they're saying something else. my own training as an academic, it took many years before I began to look at orality and its tradition seriously. In all the debates between history and memory that punctuated my years in school, college, and university, history always won. We were never taught to focus on the learnings embedded in memory or in recollections of the past. The past that many of the people I have since worked with in India does rely on orality, and to my perplexity, that past does not fit into the structures we were taught to understand as historical. Oral history interviews with artisans and traditional performers have often proved difficult, but not impossible. I have been interviewing this family, Bhattaji Prakash from Medinipur in West Bengal, for nearly 2 decades. And it has taken forever before Ranjit Chitrakat, who's the father sitting there, talks about his life as a young boy. And he finds it difficult to talk about the humiliation of paying for his painting lessons with his uncle through domestic labor. While individual scrolls and stories that he makes, he talks about those much more easily. Stories about his own life are not elaborated on. Indeed, his craft offers him a framework from within which he can focus on the learning opportunities that his life has given him, rather than on what his life has not given. All the Puranic stories, the ancient stories, the traditional stories he sings about are related to lessons that they hold out, and he's happy to talk about those. I also want to move to another colleague at Srishti who has from 2004 been working on the Kabir project, and her idea has been to actually record these songs which have been traditionally passed on orally from one generation to the other. She has tried to record them so that becomes a certain archive. Arnab Chipania, who is a compelling folk singer from Malwa, which is in central India, was born into a poor, unlettered family in 1954. He has been singing the songs of the 15th century saint Kabir. Unlike his parents, this singer completed school and college and advanced to an MA in history, after which he went on to become a school teacher. He was the headmaster of the Kanasia Middle School for girls. In the films made by Shabnam of the Kabir project, Prahlad talks only briefly about his trials and tribulations, preferring to sing his songs to delight in the insights that they open up. That's his wardrobe. So he's basically, again, the lesson that he wants to convey is the same, and he doesn't want to talk about his life because this he sees as far richer. He goes on to to sing, and I didn't play you the full song, about a king who was so proud and then his whole life, his palace, everything disappears, and he says, do not trust in this illusion. This idea of being powerful is very, very transient. And I think his song is a time-worn tale which might have had historical roots but are now lost. But the story here is used to illustrate the temporary nature of life. Although Prahlad Bania, as presented in Shabnam's film, speaks of the hard physical work he once did as a poor boy, he does not dwell on that, and indeed not on his life story either. And he spends a lot of time talking about the kind of insights he's gained into the nature of life itself. Shabnam's project also traveled to Pakistan to meet the inimitable Faid Ahmed Ayaz, an acclaimed Qawwali singer from another tradition from Karachi, who belongs to the 700-year-old Qawwal Bachcho Ka Gharana, Delhi. Literally it means School of the Children of Qawwali Singers, which go back 700 years. Although Ayaz belongs to a different tradition, he has a very deep understanding of Kabir, and he sings Kabir's couplets. And he sings also Rumi and Zahir Shah and others in the Qawwali form. In his conversation with Shabnam, he asks her, don't make Kabir into a project and just collect words. He tells her that she has to understand the story of Kabir and what he's trying to teach her. He tells her this story, and I'll read out the story in English. Once a swarm of flies asked the king of moths to give them recognition. So the king told them, you should do what the moths do, go and identify all the places in the city that were lit up at night. And the flies enthusiastically returned in the early hours and reported that they had identified so many places. And they demanded that now that they've done their task so efficiently, the king should give them recognition. And they had done this well before the moths had returned. And they said, now we should be rewarded. The king smiled and said, well, the judgment was already over, boys, because moths never return. They immerse in the light. Now this is what Ayaz says as he bids farewell to Shabnam and ends the story with a chuckle. Obviously, moths do not just go and identify the sources of light. They're drawn to it and die as they merge with the light. Flies, on the other hand, can only identify the light sources. So what Ayaz's story is a reflection of, what does it mean to truly understand Kabir? To immerse oneself in the message and absorb it rather than learn the words by rote. Ayaz seems to urge her to learn from life rather than document life. And that seems to actually indicate when I say that memory, this ancient memory, is really a site for learning. Because these stories are transmitted through the generations and they serve as an aid to remember what is truly important in life. These stories focus on events that are imagined and real. But even when real events are presented, they're shorn of chronology or historical form, instead drawing out insights that have been gained. Memory, therefore, is a site of learning that might retain a cultural salience despite colonial education. Committing these songs and stories to memory are important for training the mind so it can distinguish illusion from reality and focus on the true nature of human life. Only a trained mind can learn what is essential to life, and it can then recognize who that neighbor is and recognize also that the neighbor and oneself are not separate beings. Coming to the oral history interviews that we have been doing in the last decade or so, I want to come to the way we look at, memory even when we are doing interviews with people who are really not part of those wisdom traditions. I'm just using the wisdom traditions to illustrate the learning that can come here. Indeed, this example illustrates the struggles between forms of forgetting and ways of remembering. I am a graduate of Jadavpur University, of which Raghunath Singh was the first vice chancellor. I also taught there for more than a decade. Now, this was a project where we were commissioned to make a commemorative volume on the first vice chancellor. And while there was a lot of material about his public life, there was a reticence within the institution that commissioned the project about the time he spent away from his public life between 1974 and 1986. He spent these 12 years at Kanghal, near the pilgrimage center of Haridwar, at the ashram of Anandamuyima, a spiritual teacher who he revered deeply. In oral history interviews that he conducted with his colleagues, students, and family members, these years presented a puzzle, and it was quickly rationalized. Some said he was actually helping that organization set up a hospital because he was so good at setting things up. Others said he was helping her in the office, and they marveled that a vice chancellor was so humble and was just working like a clerk in the office. And the others said that he was always, whatever he wanted to do, he dedicated himself completely to, and therefore when he was there, he was there. He didn't want all that came with his public life. But it was his granddaughter, for whom the memory of his years at the ashram remained a lesson even 32 years after he had returned to his family because of failing health. She said, if you ignore those years, you will not know him at all. The reason I say this is because he was a very modern man who was absolutely intrigued by the latest technology, by whatever is happening in the world, what is happening in computer science and electronics, but at the same time he was very grounded. And if we don't know the years he spent at her ashram, we cannot understand that balance. For him, there was no conflict between that spiritual quest and technology. One was integrated with the other. Revisiting in memory the lessons that end-of-life changes might have brought home to her grandfather, she only linked her understanding to her grandfather's spiritual learning. His understanding of accepting change, physical infirmity, accepting the relationships of care that challenge egoistical notions of being self-sufficient. Without understanding what cultures of morality emphasize, we cannot understand her memory of her grandfather's stay at the ashram, nor can we configure the process by which she made sense of her grandfather's spiritual turn, where he was challenged to discard his pride and understand how his years at the ashram enabled him to see, recognize, and accept the deepest truth of human existence, that we are vulnerable and dependent creatures, and it is our pride that deludes us into thinking of ourselves as oneness and self-sufficient. And this often stands in the way of seeing the vulnerability of our human existence and understanding our true self. The Institute wanted a book that would reflect aspects of his life that made him an exemplary public figure, a revered teacher, and much admired and a loved guide. But as Charlotte Lynn reminds us, institutions work the past, representing in each time, in new but related ways, for a particular purpose in a particular form, that uses the past to create particular desired present and future. Institutions therefore frame memory in specific ways. In this case, what institutional memory wanted to frame through this and other commemorative acts was remembering the personality of Raghunath Singh, who cared for his students soon after partition, who intervened when refugees settled by the state near the university did not have enough to eat, who remained fearless and challenged the state when under trial political prisoners were fired at and killed. And most people themselves as reflecting that progressive vision he stood for. Within that image, there was no place for this dimension of his life, which was seen as really going back to a past that was not modern. So with that, I think, I began to see that the nature of self-reflection that memory inspires is really not straightforward. Because if we look at them, there are ways in which the past, we have to, how do we understand the past? Because this everyday spirituality that the Bauls talk about, the singers of Kabir represent, and which is not seen as a learnable, that could be part of what Hayden White has called the practical past. It is this past, rather than the historical one, that requires a narrative, which in one way or the other connects my present and that of my community to an existential present in which judgment and decision about the question, what should I do, are called for. What I require, or at least might profit from, is a narrative, a story, that relates my present to that past, of the past in which historians have little interest, because that part of the past lacks response. So now if we come to, how do we then understand the learnable that memory is? I think I'll turn to Tagore, who I often turn to, because he, again, is reflecting here on memory. Because he says, memory, I know not who paints the pictures on memory's canvas, but whoever he may be, what he's painting are pictures, by which I mean he's not there with his brush simply to make a faithful copy of all that is happening. He takes in and leaves out according to his taste. He makes many a big thing small and small thing big. In short, he's painting pictures and not writing history. So memory is, according to Tagore, strongly visual. However, pictures painted on memory's canvas are not faithful copies. So what happens when, those pictures don't have anything else challenging them? And I'll quickly recount the story of setting up the archives at the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, which is a science institute. And when I started setting this up, their founder, Homi Bhabha, had died in a very tragic air crash in 1966. All that the scientists remembered was the fact that they had a condolence meeting. They were devastated that he had died. But because he believed in a certain work ethic, they went back to work. They were shaken, but they said, we are going to work. And they said, this is what they did. And they read out, so I could find the condolence resolution, etc. Now, what was interesting is that when we started looking through the archives, this is a religious ceremony, a Farsi Utamna ceremony that was held at the foot of the library stairs, and you can see everyone in the foyer. And this was a different picture, one that most scientists have temporarily forgotten to mention. The archives had a set of these photographs. And so what did this signify? This was held on 26 January 1966. When I presented these copies to the scientists, then they immediately said, oh yes, of course we have this. It was mainly so that we could respect the wishes of his mother, Meherbai, who had made this. Now, many things had happened after Bhabha died. The institute was 21 years old. It had become very big, and it was a science institute. It was also, in the early days, it was also one where Meherbai, his mother, was very much a part of many events that were taking place. This is 4 years before he died, and I thought we'd enjoy this picture of the Queen's visit to the institute in 1952, and she was a presence in the institute from its very beginnings, and she remained a presence even later. So there, since this picture, the misremembering of the condolence ceremony was as the only ceremony, cannot be attributed really to the failure of individual memory. Rather, it indicates the way in which collective memory is shaped within institutions. As Hartwart has drawn our attention to the social metrics of memory, he is also cautioned against the conflation of collective memory and history. Memory also offers alternative approaches to the past. Remembering, forgetting, and misremembering offers us ways in which we can understand the significance of past events. The documentary evidence in this case lay buried from view, and therefore the mental image of the condolence ceremony, of which there are no photographs, took a stronger hold of the scientist's memory. Moreover, it matched their self-image as scientists who were staunchly rationalists and upheld the scientific temper, thus making the past incompatible with the present. I want to move to something a little more abstract now, and this is memories of the mutiny of 1857. And I want to say that many of these memories existed for a long time as fugitive memory, what I call fugitive memory, and I'll explain in a while why I call it fugitive. In 1957, which was 100 years after what was called the Sepoy Mutiny, two writers, Amrit Lal Nagar, here gathering the ashes and the Hindi version of the book, and Mahashwata Devi, who wrote this book called Jhansi Rani, and Raj of the Ranis by a contemporary historian. They, both Nagar and Mahashwata Devi, went in search of stories about the Gadar, as it was called, about the revolt. And as they wandered around, Amrit Lal Nagar in the Barabanki region actually found this 115-year-old man who was one of the last eyewitnesses, and he recorded his story. He actually recounts a battle from memory where Raja Balbhadra Singh of Chahlari was killed, and this is a very detailed retelling that he does. And when Mahashwata Devi begins her research on the Rani of Jhansi in the 1950s, she writes of the repercussions of the uprisings of 1857 on Damodar Rao, the adopted son of Lakshmi Bai, Rani of Jhansi. And you can't quite see him, but he's actually tied to her back, and a very iconic picture of her on the horse with her son tied to her back. The doctrine of lapse was applied to Jhansi because the king died, and Dalhousie applied the doctrine of lapse. But she had already adopted this boy because her child had died, and this was not recognized. At the same time, there was about 500,000 rupees that was held in the treasury of Jhansi, apparently for the boy, which after the revolt was no longer available for him. And this young boy, as he grew up, found that nobody really could help him, fearing repercussion from the British government that was going to him. But the memory of his adopted mother, the only mother he knew, adopted mother, the only mother he knew, haunted him till the end of his days, and his life was spent in deep distress. His son, Lakshman Rao, Jhansi Rani, worked as a typist in Indore, and these are people that she goes and meets to get some of the stories. She meets parts of the family. Mahashwata Devi's travels in Jhansi, Gwalior, Pune to undertake research for her book, Jhansi Rani, on the Rani of Jhansi, collected memories of the last moments of the Rani's life through what had been transmitted by her adopted son to his children. She had killed the soldier who had fatally shot her companion, Mandar, and those who spotted her then took her to her house, took her to a nearby house and laid her body on the ground, washed her wounds. And her son was, of course, stunned. He was still little. She regained consciousness briefly to thank them for their devotion and requested that they have the same devotion to her son Damodar, and asked them to sell her ornaments and pay her soldiers, which they couldn't do because selling her ornaments meant giving yourself away. And she made a final request, make sure the Tirangis do not get my body. Let the British not find my body. Now both of them talk about the dangers faced by soldiers who had joined the revolt. And even Indian historians who later wrote about it felt that this was very limited. We shouldn't really call it a great rebellion or anything like that. But Nagar, Nagar tells us that during my travels in the villages of Awadh, story after story talked about ordinary local people, farmers and princes and landlords who fought against the British. The stories of ordinary people and memories of the Gadar was passed down from an earlier generation but was never given the importance it deserved. On the other hand, these memories were not regarded as revealing any historical facts. As Takti Roy tells us, Western-educated middle-class urban Indians who now wrote histories found the form of protest by the rebels of 1857 outmoded compared to the modern party politics they felt eventually won the nation its independence. And Mahashweta Devi adds that until their death, those who fought in the 1857 Gadar hid their real identities, and as they roamed in India's market towns and villages and its maidans and fields, hiding in the jungles, homeless and separated from their loved ones, those soldiers embraced death in many ways in many places. Even today, it is difficult to confirm, but I have heard that one of the villages near Allahabad, an old peasant, admitted at the time of his death that he had worked for the Nawab of Banda and had seen the Rani of Jhansi at Kalki. Perhaps the Rani's attendants had died unknown and unrecognized somewhere in similar circumstances. History is silent about them. Yet markers of cultural memory remain even now, because when Major Ellis actually called on Lakshmibai on 16th of March 1854, when the doctrine of Ladzlau applies to Jhansi, he is famously known to have said, Jhansi nahi dungi. It is unconfirmed if she said it then or later, but the people did not, that day happened to be Holi, the spring festival, the festival of love. The people did not play with colors that day, and since then Holi is not celebrated in Jhansi as a remembrance of that year, even now. So there are other ways in which things are marked in memory. At times of crisis, memory, like its bearers, turn fugitive. Fugitives who do not find a memory community where they can safely share their memories and be understood. When it is safe, the fugitive comes out of hiding. But it needs a community that is empathetic. For fugitive memory, when articulated to a community that understands its import, can also be a site of learning. And with that, I want to turn ironically to the post-colonial state and how that also creates this is the Narmada. This is the site of the Narmada river, which has a huge dam that had to be developed because these areas were needed, the river was needed for the benefit of the state, for the purposes of hydroelectric power and irrigation. It displaced 250 Maharashtra, Gujarat, and Madhya Pradesh. The displacement of villagers and their grossly inadequate rehabilitation has paid scant attention to their suffering. Their memories of home, of the environment that they belong to physically and culturally, are memories that are subjugated by the post-colonial state. They appear only in oral history interviews, where they recall the time when their homes are drowned. So my final example is from this oral history of the Narmada Bachao Andolan done by Nandini Oza. So I'll just play a little bit of this video and then show you the translation. This is Keval Sen Vasave. He's one of the tribal leaders. So in this interview, this tribal leader who lost his home, what he says is interesting, that at the point where his village is going to be drowned, and he's spent 20 years protesting, saying we don't want this dam, he says at this point, Narmada, they let the waters flow, and some of them wanted to drown with their homes, but they're pulled out. But he says, it takes 8 days for my home to drown. So I greet the Narmada, because this is something nobody can understand, that we all have a relationship to the river, and she's like our mother, and therefore I greeted her as a son greets the mother. I even broke the ceremonial coconut. And of course, I think even I was quite shocked that this is what he's doing when the river comes and he's in danger of losing his life. But the relationship between the river and the community is an intimate one. And forcibly displaced from his village, having lost his lands, he's resettled in a village far away from the river. Having fought a battle he and his community could not win, he is unwilling to give up the relationship he shared with the river. The development discourse embraced by the state does not care for this memory of this relationship. In fact, it is keen to carry out punitive action against those who refuse to comply and obstruct development. Such a discourse, like the colonial discourses of the past, would see this puja, this worship of the river, when it comes to destroy his home, as a ridiculous example, an instance of foolishness. The structure of the development discourse does not accommodate either the language of kinship that he articulates or the meaning of memory that he holds so close. His memory is also a fugitive memory that holds out lessons of relationship and community, how in the past the natural world and the human world could meet, and how the loss of land, livelihood, and ways of life must be understood as existing in the realm of experience and bonds that include the human and non-human. Unlike the fugitive memories of 1857 uprising that were lost for 100 years, Keval Singh's fugitive memory would live on in the archive that Nandini Oza created. Fugitive memories of the Gadar surfaced sporadically in places, and writers who went out in search of them found only traces of these memories. The fugitive memories of recent events, such as the Narmada drowning, the mega dam being built, and the houses, the villages being drowned, as well as the 1947 partition, can live on and find a memory community within cultures of orality that still exist in post-colonial countries, and which offer us a very different understanding of the past. It is this past and the learnings it holds that are embedded in cultures of orality and their memory traditions. The violence of colonialism and the paradigms of history that colonial systems implanted continue to thrive, expunging the understanding that memory is a site of learning, turning the wisdom traditions into performance without deeper significance. The learnings embedded in such traditions too turn into fugitive memory that waits for a community that would recognize them as sites of learning. For only when we learn to recognize memory as a site of learning will we understand that much of the post-colonial world that lives outside of history but has a live relationship to the past exists in certain ways. The historical lens cannot help us understand how those who live outside history regard memory and regard the past. We can only understand them when we understand the role memory plays in enabling the community's relationship to the past. For it is that sense of the past that teaches how life must be lived and what one should prioritize in this world. Brings my presentation to an end. Hope I was able to convey this very abstract thing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very impressive lecture. We have a few minutes before coffee outside for questions, comments, and we have hopefully some mics to go around. Are there anybody? I'm trying to. Any questions? Yes, Astrid.
Sorry for wasting our time. So thank you. That was a wonderful lecture. And it's quite odd. 20 years ago, I wrote a book about memories of the mutiny. It's out in German, weird somehow. But I was very struck about what you said. And I have a question about these fugitive memories of particular incidences connected with the Rani of Jhansi and so on. I think in order to emerge, they need communities that retain them, where they acquire meaning. My understanding is also that in order to live on and probably to emerge and get stronger, they also need remediation. So they probably need sites where they inspire new stories, new poetry, new literature, art, and that's my experience with memory research over the years, that it's often through these channels that memories emerge again. And I was just asking you whether you know of such examples of newly emergent mutiny or rebellion memory. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Yes, I'm aware of your work, and in fact, I've seen, you know, the wonderful article on remediation. I think you're right about, you know, that something needs to be done, but I think the concept of the sites of learning that I'm trying to use is that the older forms of, you know, should become, the concept itself changes that form. So it doesn't stay in a folktale embedded in that typical way. It turns around and becomes something that can teach about, you know, what is so essential that you need to know. They are right now, one can't see memories of the rebellion, because I think there are various reasons why, you know, some facts about the rebellion are maybe suppressed by the state that does not want to see that the rebellion, which both these writers hint at, was really a united front where Hindus and Muslims really fought together. And that is not a part of the state discourse is very different now in India, as you know. But I think what is important to remember is that, you know, I was struck by the fact that even if there were no sites, it actually stayed within communities, even if the community was not really doing anything except not celebrating Holi on a particular day. And then you're told it is because we lost Jhansi that day. And Jhansi is not really that kingdom anymore, is it? It still has that marker. So there are different ways in which these are marked. And you're right about remediation. So, but right now I don't know if there are other new remediations that are going on.
Thank you very much. Further questions? Yes, indeed.
Thank you. I really appreciated what you were saying about this relationship between reflection, recognition, and recollection, but also about memory as a site of learning. And I was wondering about the pedagogical implications of that, both in India and in the UK as former colonizer. So memory as a site of learning and the pedagogical implications and practices. Thank you.
I think, you know, it's an idea I borrowed, which basically these were experiments that were being done by Gandhi in his Naitali, in his way of education, or Tagore when he felt that you have to reinvent what was there traditionally because you have to remember what was important to learn. And right now we seem to want to replicate rather mechanically, and that is not a site of learning. The site of learning actually would be when you say this is what you need to learn, and therefore it has to be made appropriate to the times. And I would have, you know, I would say that it would be interesting to look at historical memory together and see whether they were, you know, whether they are cultural forms that can be shared across borders to see, you know, how did we, you know, how do we learn about people who were in India, let's say, people from the UK who were there in the past, who were part of our colonial past, and how we, you know, contributed to something. It's something to be thought about. It's just that I found that the idea that memory is also about learning an interesting insight that I drew from my training in literature and culture, making this distinction between history and memory.
Very important as a reminder for us also what type of community we imagine ourselves to be and what kind of community we put into practice. We have maybe, yes, another question, maybe the last one.
Also, thank you so much from me for your very inspiring lecture, particularly because I was also working on fugitive memories in the Caribbean context, where it of course relates to formerly enslaved people. But my question relates to the opposition of history and memory. And it seems very convincing in the colonial state to make that opposition. But I wonder whether in the long term that is productive to see it in such an opposition, because it seems to be rather more oppressive to leave history in that position as an opposing force. And it seems to me that the archive project that you were speaking about, and you working as an oral historian in the affirmative, if that's not really a way of transforming history and a way that memory and history collaborate in a very productive way, because I would assume that you don't consider your archival work as a form of colonial enforcement.
Thank you for that. I think I must clarify here that if I look at the discipline of history in India at present, it does not accommodate oral history. It does not accommodate all these traditions. These are left to the anthropologists. These don't seem to have markers. These are not markers of the past. And so I really feel that we should have actually made history into a different kind of site of learning, which didn't happen. So it's a very mechanical reproduction of what history is like. So the narrative that Hayden White talks about, those are not incorporated. So I like your idea of collaboration between two kinds of, two ways of understanding the past. And I think if we look at oral history, I think one had to really argue with the institutions which wanted to set up archives and didn't have documents for everything, but had people who had worked there for long. But most institutions saw that effort as really filling in the gaps. And I had to argue with them that this was not about filling in the gaps. This was really about what the institution meant to the people who worked in it. And this is slightly different from, history, because they'd always say, this is, how do you account for failures of memory? Why do you want to spend money recording things that are wrong? Whereas I felt that this, even misremembering, would have a certain significance, and we were not looking for facts when we were recording oral histories. So yeah, the work we did was not, it was a bit working against the grain, because history wanted certain things and which we couldn't do through oral history, because oral history looked at memory and meaning making very, very differently. That's a very, very important point.
Yeah, also a reminder that we're certainly hoping that history becomes much more flexible and welcoming of different approaches, as Hayden White certainly hoped for with the very concept of the practical past, because he was always hoping that historians embrace the practical past as well. And there's signs that that is happening, at least in some places.